Hello, I'm Terry David Mulligan, and this is Mulligan Stew, the podcast. Music, film, food, and wine. In this case, it's music, because we're going to talk to Billy Bragg. I can't tell you how long I waited to have a conversation with Billy Bragg, but little did I know that it would be based upon his book, not an album, but a book, Billy Bragg, Roots, Radicals, and Rockers, How Skiffle Changed the World. And right off the top, my first question to Billy Bragg is, how did Skiffle change the world? And 7 minutes later, I had my show back. Well, no, about 27 minutes later, I got my show back. It's brilliantly written, and it's true. Here's how it all happened. After the Second World War, British teenagers had no music of their own, of course, but they were listening to Americana, so to speak. They were listening to Big Bill Broonzy, but especially they were listening to Leadbelly. In order to play the music of Leadbelly, you needed a washboard, a chest with a string on it that was a bass, and you needed a guitar. That's where it all started. All of a sudden, there was a singer on stage and on television and on radio with a guitar in his hand. The first one ever, Lonnie Donegan, and he did Rock Island Line, and he went crazy on stage, and the audience went nuts. And that's just the start, because July the 6th, 1957, in Liverpool, actually a small town called Walton, John Lennon watched Lonnie Donegan on stage, and then later he hooked up with a couple of guys who wanted to play with him, Paul McCartney and George Harrison. And they all played skiffle. As a matter of fact, when they went to Germany, they all played skiffle. Skiffle also gave us the first music of Van Morrison and David Bowie and Jimmy Page and every other Brit that picked up a guitar or played the drum. Skiffle really did change the world. Please. And because he is a recording artist, a couple of years ago, Billy Bragg hooked up with his friend Joe Henry, and they did Shine a Light field recordings from the Great American Railroad. And he did it when the trains stopped across America. They would go to a sidecar or a train station or a mechanical barn, and they would record a song. They'd get maybe 2 or 3 opportunities to record that song. Then they had to get back on that train and keep going. He's quite a guy. Enjoy the stories and the passion of the one and only Billy Bragg. How are you? Hello,
I'm very
Billy.
well, Joe. How are you?
Thank you, man. And welcome back to the West Coast of Canada.
Great to be here.
In Canada in particular. Mm-hmm. July the 13th, 1954, Lonnie Donegan would record Rock Island Line, and it's all chronicled in a great book coming your way called Roots, Radicals, and Rockers, How Skiffle Changed the World. And I'm glad you put in the subtext line.
Yeah.
Because, and that's a grand statement. How did this form of music that
nobody's ever heard of,
they don't know what we're talking about, how did it change the world?
Well, first and foremost, one of the reasons why I wanted to write the book was because it's forgotten. The story's forgotten now. But basically what happens is in the mid-50s in the UK, a form of music arrives that's basically what we would call Americana, American roots music. And it inspires a generation of British schoolboys between the ages of about 12 and 18 to do something that's never really been done in British culture before, which is to pick up guitars.
Guitars.
Yeah, Lonnie Donegan, who's hit Rock Island Line, sparked the whole thing off in 56, is the first British artist to get in the charts playing a guitar. And these kids, not only did they start playing Leadbelly's repertoire, broadly speaking, that's what a skiffle is, right, but they also used the guitar to define themselves against their parents' culture. They're the first proper British teenagers, and the music they make, skiffle, is the first music that is not music that's been given to them like novelty music for kids. They make it themselves.
And they loved that it was dismissed by their parents.
That's the best thing. That's the best thing about it. But you've got to remember also this generation had grown up with rationing. Rationing didn't end until 1954, 63 years ago. Yeah. And after the war, there were some things were rationed that weren't rationed during the war. Bread was rationed after the war because the British had to feed people in Germany, in the British zone in Germany, with resources that they themselves had. So it was a tough old time. And so someone like John Lennon, born in 1940, would have got to the age of 15 before he was able to go in a sweet shop and buy what he wanted.
Exactly.
So these guys had a really kind of like tight make do and mend kind of childhood, and suddenly along comes this music that not only is accessible to them, You only have to know 3 chords to play almost all Lonnie Donegan songs.
And you don't have to be American.
You don't have to be American to sing these songs. But more importantly than that, it kind of empowers them to make their own culture.
There's a great quote here. Those who were there, January 1956, the name of the first British artist to get into the charts singing and playing a guitar is as evocative to them as the name of the first man on the moon is for the next generation that followed. You didn't have to be formally trained. You didn't have to come from America. And you just gave some great figures. The annual sales of guitars in Britain was 5,000. It jumped to 250,000.
Yeah. And one of the things about that is almost all of the people who were buying those guitars were kids. This was a craze, like a playground craze, like a hula hoop. It wasn't a scene like punk rock, although it was very similar to punk rock. So as a result of that, if you look back now at the skiffle scene, there are a handful of hit singles, and the whole thing is over after 18 months. But the truth of the matter is that those young teenagers, you know, George Harrison was 14, Paul McCartney was 15, John Lennon was 13. George was 13, Paul was 14, and Leonard just turned 16 when they saw Donegan in 1956.
In Liverpool.
In Liverpool. They were inspired to such an extent to make skiffle music that when they went to Hamburg in 1960, the German wrestler who was their minder told an American journalist in the 1960s, the trouble was when they arrived, they played too much of that washboard music. You know, they were still basically...
They were the Silver Beatles, yes.
They were the Quarrymen.
Yeah,
they were still the Quarrymen, even when they got to Hamburg. It was Hamburg that turned them into a rock and roll band. But that's what this is the story of. It's the story of the music that was the nursery for the British invasion of the American and the Canadian charts in the 1960s.
For the current generation who can't connect those dots, the easy way through is to just name the artists who came after.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about Billy Glitter or all of those guys. No.
On the 6th of July 1957, John Lennon's skiffle band, the Quarrymen, played a church fete in a place called Woolton, which is a suburb of Liverpool. Yes. And this kid came along, Paul McCartney, and kind of impressed Lennon by tuning his guitar, firstly, and then playing a 20-Flight Rock by Eddie Cochran. Yeah. And then McCartney's mate, younger friend, George Harrison, he eventually joined the band as well. So skiffle is not only the music that inspired the Beatles, but it inspired Van Morrison, who was 12 years old when he first heard Rock Island Line. I mean,
But his dad was playing it.
His dad was playing, but he could not imagine himself playing it. That's the thing. You know, he thought... I spoke to him for the book. I interviewed him. I had a lovely breakfast in Ladbroke Grove with him. What a fabulous image, isn't it? Having breakfast in Ladbroke Grove with Van Morrison. And he spoke very, very touchingly about particularly Lonnie Donegan, hearing Lonnie Donegan, because he had musical aspirations at the time, but only as a folk artist. There's no way he could imagine himself playing the blues. He heard Donegan, and Donegan just opened the door for him.
He really did kick the doors open, didn't he?
He did. And for Van, that led to Astral Weeks. Now, someone else like David Bowie, who first performance was at a scout camp playing Lonnie Donegan songs. You know, he kind of goes in a rather circuitous way because he's inspired by another skiffler who becomes the very first British rock and roller, who's Tommy Steele. He sees Tommy Steele in 1957 and decides he wants to do that job. So it's the idea that skiffle is the seedbed for really everything in British music up to punk. You know, Jimmy Page, there's a clip of Jimmy Page on YouTube as a 14-year-old playing a song called Mama Don't Allow No Skiffle Playing Round Here. And he tells Hugh Weldon, the rather avuncular a host of the show, that he doesn't want to be a guitar player. He wants to do biological research.
And he does both.
He does both. Happily for us, he was able to indulge both his passions to the benefit of all of us.
I had so much fun making notes. As I said, I don't know why I wrote them down. For years, British pop was spoon-fed, was groomed. Everybody had to be good-looking. They had to be fully packaged, handed their own material. And Lonnie blew a hole in all of that. Elvis was the competition. He never toured there, but he certainly was. You had Tommy Steele. But then, to show you the state of British music, then came Billy Fury, Johnny Gentle, Vince Eager, Dickie Pride, Duffy Power, and the one and only Georgie Fame.
Georgie Fame, the great Georgie Fame,
Georgie Fame.
It was a very great period in British pop, but all those guys had been, if you ask them, it was Donegan who first gave them the idea that they could play music and play guitar. The guitar was so unfamiliar to British youth that Bill Drummond from KLF, the band KLF, he's read the book. He said to me the first time he saw a skiffle band, he was 6 years old. His father was the priest in a prison, and they had a Christmas concert, and there was a band where the prisoners played skiffle. He thought the guitar player had a hole in his stomach that he was playing. Now, it would not be possible now in our culture to get to the age of 6 without seeing someone playing a guitar. But for British kids, the only people who play guitar that you might hear on the radio would be singing cowboys, Calypsonians, because they came over with in 1948 with the Windrush generation, or old blues guys like Big Bill Brunsey, who used to tour.
Sure.
The guitar was an outsider's instrument. It wasn't something that was part of our culture. And by taking it, those kids were declaring themselves to be outsiders.
And especially having a lead singer stand up there and play it. Right. So one of the handoffs from one camp to another was the fact that it was do-it-yourself music, right? You could build your own instruments if you had to. And do-it-yourself music was what drove the whole punk scene. So there's that link there.
There were some very strong similarities. I mean, the key tenet of punk rock was here's 3 chords, now form a group. Yeah. And, of course, you only needed to play 3 chords in order to play almost all the skiffle repertoire. So there's that. But more importantly, it really helped me as someone who was 19 in 1977 and experienced punk both as a member of the audience but also as a performer, to see skiffle through the prism of that experience really helped me to understand. For instance, we haven't touched on this yet, but skiffle actually came out of trad jazz. It started because the trad jazz players in Britain in the 40s and 50s were learning to play by listening to records made in the 1920s. And on those records, because the recording equipment was so poor, everybody blew really hard so they could be heard. So the British jazzers, they blew really hard because they thought that's how you did trad jazz, and their lips went numb within 30 minutes. So they had to keep the audience interested, they introduced these Leadbelly songs on acoustic guitars. And that kind of started
as a break.
Yeah, as a break, yeah.
It's their version of a drum solo.
Exactly, yeah. It's their version. It's kind of like educated thing, you know. But I understood from, my experience in punk, that the trad jazzers who believed that only the real jazz was made in New Orleans in the start of the 20th century is a similar back-to-basics impulse that drove the Ramones and Dr. Feelgood in my country as the precursors of punk rock.
Wow. And then when we get, then of course, there's the whole British invasion. The ironic thing, when you go back and look at that last chapter, you start to total up the bands that we knew, that we never knew came from skiffle, but they all had skiffle.
There's a period between when the Beatles had their first number one in the US at the beginning of 1964 to the end of 1965. There's a British band at number one in the Billboard charts, 52 weeks out of 104. Every single one of those bands started out as a skiffle outfit.
And, when you look at Pete Townshend, thrashing that guitar, you can't imagine that he was in your audience.
He was a jazz gig, and he actually physically saw Donegan come from the back in the rhythm section where he's playing his banjo to the front with the guitar, and he realised in that moment that was his epiphany.
Exactly.
That the world was going to change. He was going to get a guitar, and he was going to get rid of that old jazz, because his father was a trombone player in a swing band. So that's a revolutionary moment right there.
I'm Terry David Mulligan. He is Billy Bragg. What's your middle name?
William.
William. Okay.
My first name is Stephen. Only my dentist calls me Stephen now. Stephen. And some of my aunties.
You're a long way from your dentist now.
I am, as you can tell with my British teeth.
Now the book has been out for a bit. That's a good read, mate.
I enjoyed writing it. I enjoyed writing it, Jerry, because it was another discipline. It was something else to do, clear my mind after making the Shine a Light album, which weirdly the Shine a Light, the Train Song album grew out of.
Well, that's what I'm going to ask. What came first?
The book. It was writing the book, and I became aware, looking at the material that the skifflers played, it was all these railroad songs from America, and there were so many of them. And I was trying to think, why are there so many railroad songs? And it's partly to do with the change that the railroad brought to a country like Canada.
Yeah.
I mean, before the railroad came, it was really only viable to build a city on a river.
Yeah.
Because it was totally impossible to build anywhere else. You couldn't get the material there. Once the railroad come, everything changes. Everything changes. So up until then, that's why New Orleans was such a key cultural city, because everything from the American interior was coming down to the Caribbean via New Orleans, because it's the only way to get up into the, up to the Great Lakes region even, So that whole aspect of the railroad song started me thinking about maybe making a railroad record. I spoke to Joe Henry, my good buddy, and suggested we sort of do that by getting on a train and going across America and recording when the train stopped, jumping off, recording a song and jump back on again.
And how long were those breaks? 12 minutes?
Well,
15 minutes?
No, actually, this is the interesting thing. West of the Mississippi, there are so few passenger trains. There's only really tourist routes. So between St. Louis and San Antonio, we were the only train all day, passenger train. And San Antonio to Los Angeles, we're the only one every other day. So they've got lots of freight trains. They put more freight on the rail in America than any other industrialized nation. So when a passenger train comes to a station, they use one of the other platforms as like a siding.
Yes.
So you pull in. You might stay for 30 minutes, 40 minutes. It's wait time, and that's ostensibly to allow people to get off and have a smoke or to buy a coffee or something like that. But it also allows you to go and do 3 takes of a popular railroad song.
Very nice. Now, Willin' is a trucker's song.
That's true.
That's a Lowell George song. I love that song.
It's probably, if there was a song that summed up my whole shtick, I would choose that song. It's a great song.
I love that song.
Because I'm willing. That's why I got on a plane yesterday to come all the way to Vancouver to talk about Skiffle. I don't do that, but I am definitely, you got to be willing to do this job.
You did a Gordon Lightfoot. I thought you were going to do a Canadian Railroad trilogy.
Bit long. The train would have left before we got to the end of it.
So you did, was it Early Morning Rain?
Yeah. Because with that, we wanted first of all, Joe and I wanted some songs from our own lifetimes rather than relying on old Carter family songs and old blues songs. But more importantly than that, Early Morning Rain is a snapshot of the moment where the golden age of railroad comes to an end. The guy is sitting at the airport and he's looking at the plane taking off, and he says, "You can't jump a jet plane like you can a freight train."
Yeah,
and that's it. That when transcontinental air travel becomes cheap enough for everybody to afford, the railroad is finished. The hobo is finished, and so it seemed particularly that song to be the final song on the album. We recorded it at 5 o'clock in the morning at Los Angeles Grand Central Station.
Nicely done.
Grand Union Station, rather, and it just summed the whole thing up for us.
There's a couple of quotes I'll throw at you in the speed round, but it's a highly political time, as you well know, in Britain and in America.
Of course.
And conversely, we're right in the middle. We're right beside the whole
Yeah, you are.
show.
You are.
And I just did a special on whatever happened to the protest song.
Yeah.
Is it alive and well? Is it coming? Where's the pushback from the artist? What do you think?
Well, I think we have to recognise, Jerry, that music has lost its vanguard role in youth culture. That's what's happened, because when I was 19, if I was angry about the world, there was only one medium available to me. In some ways, music in the 20th century was our social medium. It had to encompass everything that we thought as young people. Love, politics, football, everything. But now, if you're 19 and you're angry, you don't have to learn to play guitar, write songs and do gigs to have your voice heard. You can, start a Twitter storm or run up a Facebook page. You can do all those other things. So in that sense, music has lost its vanguard role, but it still has a very important role to play in bringing people together to express their solidarity and to make them feel like they're not alone. And this is not just a political thing either. If you go to an Adele concert and there's a song there that you've invested a lot of emotion to, and Adele sings the song, everybody else is singing that song too. Your emotions are immediately accepted by everybody. So that's a very, very important role.
Yeah.
And in my country, there's still some music with edge. It's very interesting during the election campaign that it was the grime artists, if you know what grime is. It's black urban music. It's very edgy. It was they who stood up in support of Jeremy Corbyn as a community, not just one or two of them, but they all stood up. White guys with guitars, nowhere to be seen, apart from me, obviously. But it was the grime artists, and I think they are still using music to communicate because, to be honest, it's the only way they're going to get their voice in your timeline and my timeline.
Yeah.
So to them, music still has that power. For the rest of us, I think we fall back on what music always had, which is our currency as musicians is empathy. Music can make you feel something for people you've never met. And we live in a time when in some ways there's a war on empathy. The right attack anyone who expresses any compassion, particularly for people outside their gender, their race, their ethnicity, their national group. They attack it and dismiss it as political correctness or virtue signaling. So we who use empathy to communicate, I think we have to up that. We have to focus on that, and we have to counter their cynicism with our compassion.
Of course, if you don't feel adequate or talented enough to actually write or speak or whatever, I hear there's a movement afoot that if Mr. Trump shows up in England, called "Show Your Rump to Trump."
That's true. That's true.
Wow.
We're working on that. He's going to try and sneak in, I think. He still wants to have dinner with the Queen. You know what he's like on that kind of stuff.
Billy Bragg is in studio for just, 60 seconds.
Yeah.
And then you're done like that.
Have we covered everything?
Pretty much.
What can I do?
What do you want to know about us?
I can tell you a joke if you like.
Yeah.
Okay, a duck is about to cross the road when a chicken runs over and says to him, "For Christ's sake, don't do that. You're never at the end of it."
And you're getting a standing ovation for the controller.
I keep it clean.
He is a storyteller. Thanks for listening to this week's show. And remember, please subscribe to the Mulligan Stew podcast to receive fresh episodes weekly. You can subscribe via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Play Music. I'm Terry David Mulligan. Thank you for listening.